The trolley problem. This thought experiment and its associated memes have probably done more to popularize philosophy over the past 10 years than decades of educational spending. Friend of the channel, Alex O'Connor, has even done an entire series analyzing these memes. And it is no mystery how trolley problems have become so popular. It has a simple premise, it's very easy to create variations, and it raises a huge number of philosophical questions. However, despite all of this, we very rarely look into the origins of the problem. Because this goes far beyond a simple test to tell if you're a utilitarian, and it strikes at the heart of how we might build and refine our own ethical systems. By the end of this video, I hope you'll understand this famous thought experiment a little bit more. But even more importantly, I hope that you'll have a firmer and more detailed grasp of your own ethical intuitions. Get ready to learn what self-driving cars might have to do with rogue trolleys, why you might want to pose less realistic thought experiments, and what the villains in cowboy films have done for philosophical innovation. Obviously, there is a huge literature out there on this topic, and I'll be unable to cover it all. For this video, I've tried to prioritize breadth over depth so that you can decide which aspects of the trolley problem and its associated writings you would like to look into further. So, let's begin by outlining the basics of this meme-worthy issue for those of us that are unfamiliar, and trace some of its earliest uses. But before any of that, the first thing you should know about trains and trolleys is that they have incredibly insecure Wi-Fi networks. Luckily, you can stay private online just by using today's video partner NordVPN. I like to work in coffee shops. It makes me feel like a cool, sophisticated philosopher rather than an up-jumped, pretentious little twerp from Essex. But, like any public network, this comes with a problem. If I'm not careful, hackers can intercept data from the unsecured network, leaving all the horrible, embarrassing things I send over the internet available for a stranger's eyes. Helpfully, NordVPN encrypts all my data, meaning I can safely cosplay Albert Camus in peace. Their Threat Protection Pro also protects you against malware, phishing, and untrustworthy websites, making it a very valuable tool for staying safe online. But that's not all. NordVPN also lets you change your location, allowing you to watch programs that may not be available in your country. I personally use it to watch the deeply underrated musical comedy show Gallivant that is unavailable in the UK. And I highly encourage you to do so as well. It's by the same guy who wrote all the music for The Little Mermaid. By using my link at nordvpn.com/advicevpn, you can get an exclusive deal and 4 months of bonus usage. Plus, they're also offering a 30-day back money guarantee, so on the off chance it's not your thing, you can just use that. It's totally risk-free, I've been using it, and I've found it incredibly valuable. But anyway, back to the video. 1. Humble beginnings and early tests. While there were precursors to it, the modern trolley problem really finds its origins in Philippa Foot's paper on the doctrine of double effect. Here, Foot is trying to illustrate the relevance of this idea to various modern-day issues, as well as criticize it in some respects. For those who haven't come across it, the doctrine of double effect suggests that sometimes we permit the negative consequences of an action where they are foreseen, but nonetheless unintended, and a side effect of some greater good. To take a classic example, imagine that I was a doctor and one of my patients was in unimaginable pain. I might administer a medicine which does raise the likelihood of them dying, but will also alleviate a huge proportion of this pain. The doctrine of double effect would state that if that patient then dies, I would be far less morally culpable than if I had just set out to kill the patient with the medicine and the alleviation of pain was the side effect. Considering how iconic trolley problems have become, Foot basically tosses it out there in a couple of sentences. In this initial formulation, we do not yet have the charmingly drawn meme man and his little lever. But instead, we are asked to imagine we are the driver of the trolley, making a decision between whether to hit 5 workmen on one track or 1 workman on another track. I'm not 100% sure when we switch from looking at workmen who happen to be on tracks to people tied to tracks. It seems at some point that the tied-up example becomes more prevalent, but I'm not entirely sure why. Foot's contention is that it would be permissible for the driver to steer away from the 5 people and towards the 1 person, and most people tend to agree. The trolley driver is forced into a situation where they will either kill 1 person or kill 5, and Foot suggests that, all else being equal, he should hit the 1 person rather than the 5. She contrasts this with the case of a judge who knowingly executes an innocent man to calm down a wrathful mob who are threatening to hang 5 people if the judge does not find a culprit for this hypothetical heinous crime. Foote argues that the judge's actions here would be impermissible, and in later empirical tests where people are asked their opinion on similar situations, most tend to agree with Foote. However, in both cases, the action is done for the greater good and the consequences are better for it, so what gives? The doctrine of double effect attempts to explain this because whereas the trolley driver is not really intending to kill the one person, it's just a side effect of his turning to save the five. The judge really does intend to kill the innocent man. It is an essential and direct component to his plan to placate the mob. Foote explains the discrepancy slightly differently, and in doing so makes the first philosophical point that invokes the trolley problem. She argues that the trolley driver faces conflicting negative duties of the same kind. That is, he has a duty to not kill the five people and a duty to not kill the one person. But, since he cannot fulfill both of these duties, he should pick the lesser of two evils, which is the one person. As Foote puts it, in the circumstances, he is not able to avoid both, and it seems clear that he should do the least injury he can. However, the judge's case is different. He faces a conflict between his negative duty to not execute innocent people and the positive duty to help the other innocent people. But we generally consider our duty not to harm others as much stronger than our duty to go out of our way to help others. As a result, the judge is violating the more authoritative of his duties if he chooses to execute the innocent man. For Foote, this is what makes it impermissible. Interestingly, we haven't yet directly touched utilitarianism. The trolley problem, as it's been used in academic philosophical literature, is not primarily a test for utilitarian theories, but rather seeing what additional morally relevant information there might be other than consequences. To draw upon later work by Francis Cam, we are weighing up side constraints, or the relative importance of different non-consequentialist aspects to moral decision-making. We can view this as extra-utilitarian concerns. But even though Foote originated the trolley problem, her primary philosophical interests ended up laying elsewhere. And the thought experiment was later developed into some of its more famous versions by the American philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson. And she was often concerned with the difference between killing someone and letting them die. This is where the famous transplant problem took center stage. Thomson outlines a scenario that is, in utilitarian terms, quite similar to the trolley problem. Imagine, again, that I am a doctor, and I have 5 patients who are in desperate need of organ transplants, or else they will die. Luckily, a healthy patient strolls into my office with just the organs I need. Am I permitted to kill them in order to harvest their organs to save my other patients? Thomson says I am not, and many people explain this by saying that, unlike in the case of the driver, this is not a difference between killing 5 people and killing 1 person, but rather killing 1 person and simply letting 5 die. However, Thomson adds a lot of caveats and innovation to this approach. As she points out, sometimes we do permit killing 1 person in order to save 5 from dying, even when the alternative is only letting them die. For instance, say that I was not the driver of the trolley, but instead a passenger who has had to suddenly take over when the driver was incapacitated. Then it arguably would be a decision between letting the 5 die and killing the 1, since I had only just seized control of the trolley. I wasn't the one that set it in motion. However, Thomson argues that it is permissible for me to redirect the trolley even in this instance. And my intuitions do tend to agree. Let me know if yours do. She explains this with an argument about claims and obligations. In her mind, if the 6 people on the tracks all got there in the same way, then they each have an equal claim to be spared. Thus, the numbers game wins out. However, in the transplant case, the person with the healthy organs has a much stronger claim to them than the 5 people in need of a transplant. Thus, Thomson thinks it would not be permissible to override that side constraint even for the greater utilitarian good. The same goes for the so-called toppling variant of the trolley problem. In this case, we are asked whether it is permissible to stop the trolley from hitting the 5 people by throwing another person off a bridge in the path of the trolley who is large enough to stop it in its tracks. Thomson says this is impermissible for the very same reason as the transplant case. The man's claim to not be toppled onto the tracks overrides the claim of those already tied to the tracks to be saved via his toppling. This argument about claims potentially complicates the utilitarian picture of the world, and it does seem to chime with much of our common sense talk and intuitions around ownership, especially ownership of one's own body. So, that's just to give you a taste of the different ways in which the trolley problem has been used by philosophers, and please do leave your own intuitions in the comments below. In which situations do you think it is permissible to sacrifice the 1 to save the 5, and when do utilitarian concerns win out? But now, I want to talk more broadly about the different variables in this experiment and how they contribute to the trolley problem's different potential uses. Think of it as a sort of cookbook for constructing your very own trolley problems. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my patrons to help support the channel and get access to occasional exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. The moving parts of the trolley. One of the great strengths of the trolley problem is its versatility. With enough ingenuity, you can create hundreds of different variations, and indeed, people have. Sometimes, the ones created for a laugh are virtually indistinguishable from the ones with a serious purpose in mind. And yet, there tend to be a few consistent themes in what changes from trolley problem to trolley problem, and the explanatory theories used to justify the various conclusions people draw. So, what makes this thought experiment tick? The first, and perhaps the simplest variable, is just the number of people involved. This can be used to test how strong different side constraints on consequentialist decision-making are by scaling up the difference in consequence. For example, imagine that it was not just 5 people tied to the track, but 1,000. In this case, would I be permitted to topple the innocent person in the way despite his superior claim to the use of his body? If you answer yes, then that tells you something about your moral intuitions. This side constraint is less significant for you than it would be for someone who says we still cannot topple the innocent man. On the other hand, there might be side constraints that resist scalability entirely. Imagine that there are 10,000 people on one track, all of whom have volunteered to be hit by the trolley, while there is one person tied to the other track very much against their will. In this case, many people might argue that we still should not divert the trolley to hit the one person who definitely does not want to be there, simply to save the 10,000 people that do. Secondly, there's the issue of who is making the decision. Do we think it matters whether it's the driver who is redirecting the trolley, or someone by the sidelines pulling a lever to change the tracks? This bystander version is probably now the most famous variant of the trolley problem, since it involves the charmingly drawn little meme man we were talking about earlier. But this was a later addition by Thompson in 1985, drawing from a previous 1980 paper. So quite a few years after the trolley problem was initially introduced by Foote. Here, Thompson argues that the role of the decision maker has some moral relevance. If the bystander does not get involved at all, then they have not done anyone any harm. They simply let things play out as they would. Unlike the driver, they will not end up killing 5 people. But if they step up and decide to pull the lever, then they do commit a harm. They both insert themselves into the situation and kill someone with their decision. Thompson still argues that it is permissible for the bystander to intervene in this way, but seems to suggest it is a less clear-cut case than with the driver. Other intuitions may differ, and Thompson herself argued in a later 2008 paper that, upon reflection, she thinks the bystander should not get involved. Either way, changing the person who is making the decision raises a number of questions. A, who has the right to make moral decisions in given situations? And B, how does this cohere with the killing versus letting die distinction? In a modified version of the transplant case, Thompson imagines that the surgeon had previously deliberately poisoned his 5 sick patients with a chemical, but now feels remorse and wishes to save them. And he wants to do this by killing the one healthy person in order to replace all of their damaged organs. Thompson argues that in this situation, we would still not let the doctor kill the healthy person, even though now it's a choice between killing one person and killing 5 people, since we would probably say that if the other patients are sick because the doctor poisoned them, then he probably has killed them. As Thompson points out, all killing involves letting die at some point. Thirdly, there's the relationship between the potential victims and the decision makers. One variant on the trolley problem asks us to imagine that the 5 people are not going to die by being hit by the trolley, but that their life support machines will be severed, all of which are being privately provided by the decision maker. Here, Francis Cam argues the decision maker should not kill the one to save the 5, both because of the distinction between killing and letting die, but also because she thinks they would have a right to remove the care that they had no obligation to provide in the first place. In effect, she thinks the letting die becomes more justifiable because of a particular relationship between the decision maker and the victim. To take another example, imagine that there are 3 tracks, one with 5 people on, another with 1 person on, and a third with the decision maker on. Then we can ask whether we have an obligation to take on the sacrifice ourselves before we would delegate it to another person. This also seems relevant if the decision maker is one of the victims in the two-track case. To draw from another of Cam's examples, imagine that the five saw the car coming and were able to put down a shield that deflected the trolley onto the other track, and as a result killed the one person tied up there. For that matter, imagine this same situation in reverse, where the one person managed to deflect the trolley using their shield, leading to the deaths of the five. In either case, Cam suggests that people would be acting permissibly because it is effectively self-defense. She thinks we should allow people to act to save their own lives even when it is not for the overall greater good. However, Cam also suggests we might think differently if sacrificing the other person was not a side effect of self-defense, but rather a necessary part of our plan. Say we were one of the five on the track and we managed to lasso the man on the bridge and pull him in front of the trolley to stop it before it got to us. Cam suggests that in this case we would probably view it as impermissible. It is no longer we protected ourselves and as a result someone got killed, but rather we protected ourselves by killing someone. Remember, this would still be in the context of saving 5 lives over 1, so we would still firmly be in greater good territory. Situations where the victim is also the decision maker might help you gauge how partial to one's own interests you think someone is permitted to be when they're making moral decisions. Is it permissible to put our lives first, and if so, to what extent? Lastly, we can think about the means by which the trolley is either diverted or stopped. As Thompson framed the trolley problem in her earliest paper on the subject, why is it that some ways of sacrificing 1 to save 5, such as in Foot's driver-based trolley problem, are permissible, while some others, like the transplant case, are not? Cam has suggested that the means by which the ethical trade is made is very important. She draws the distinction between methods that substitute the 1 for the 5 and those that subordinate the 1 to the 5. This is a slightly tricky distinction to get your head round, and Cam has a variety of formulations of it, but it's best illustrated by examples. In Foot's original case, Cam suggests that diverting the trolley is an act of substitution. There were going to be 5 killed by the trolley, but the 1 was substituted in their place. The idea here is that the trolley was on course to hit either the 1 person or the 5, and the 1 was chosen. On the other hand, if we were to push the man in the way of the trolley, Cam would suggest that this is subordination. We are sort of roping in someone who was otherwise entirely uninvolved and in no danger, and making them a sacrifice as a mere means to save the 5. There are definitely sprinklings of cant here, as I'm sure you can spot. Others have suggested that the particular causal chain might be morally relevant. This differs from the doctrine of double effect because it is not nearly as concerned with the intention of the decision maker, but rather the method by which they achieve their goal. Scenarios that look at this might include separating the threats to the 1 and the 5. For instance, Cam outlines a scenario where stopping 1 trolley hitting 5 involves starting a different trolley which will then kill 1 other person. Cam has also outlined a 3-track trolley problem, which asks whether it is more justified to kill 1 to save 5, or to divert the trolley to a 3rd track, where it then prevents paramedics from reaching 5 further people who are dying of an unrelated illness or injury. So there, the choice is between letting 5 die, killing 1, or letting another 5 die, but they're being threatened by something else entirely. This is the point where the trolley problems become increasingly difficult to visualize, but that's certainly a nice one to chew on. So, obviously, there are more things about the trolley problem scenarios we could change, but those are the major ones. Normally, when a new trolley problem is constructed, it is altering one or many of these variables. If you like, you can pause the video and have a go at making some impromptu trolley problems of your own. It's a lot of fun if, like me, you spend your Saturday nights doing philosophy. But, having clarified and explored some of the ways the trolley problem is used in philosophy, I want to temporarily switch tracks, and instead discuss how it is invoked in an entirely different field. 3. Psychological trolley problems. Though the trolley problem was originally conceived to ask what we should do, it has recently been seized on by psychologists and experimental philosophers to ask, what would people actually do in such a situation? What do non-philosophers think we should do in trolley problem cases, and what impact should that have on ethical philosophical investigation? To kick us off, in a series of experiments, Joshua Green found that people are more likely to view an action in a morally poor light if it involves harming by personal force and also the intention to harm. In other words, he found that people tended to view the choice as more morally condemnable if it involved both a direct intention to harm a single person in order to save the five, and when that harm was done directly, with one's own two hands. At first, it can be difficult to see the difference of this personal harm factor from an outside perspective, but it does make a certain sort of sense that people would have this intuition. After all, there is something undeniably grim about having to enact hurt with your own body. Interestingly, this links with some of the literature on drone warfare, where Peter Azzaro and Laurie Calhoun both argue that a certain amount of psychological distance can take place between the pilot and their targets. They argue this can make the prospect of killing someone seem easier for the person flying the drone. Another good example of psychological research utilizing the trolley problem is by Alessandro Lanteri. With some colleagues, he made a number of interesting observations about how people respond to the trolley problem in practice. He first points out that people are likely to be using a mixture of moral and non-moral intuitions to make their decision. For instance, while most people did agree with Thompson that turning the lever would be permissible, but that toppling the man in the way of the trolley would be impermissible, they were also less likely to agree to pulling the lever if they were first asked if they would topple the man. Lanteri theorizes that the emotional aversion to doing harm with your own hands lingers long enough to affect your thinking in the lever scenario as well. Alternatively, they might have been motivated by an underlying desire to remain consistent, being unaware of the ways philosophers have argued that these situations are relevantly different. With the advent of virtual reality machines, researchers have also occasionally tested people's responses to being in a simulated trolley problem. The idea is to mimic some of the emotional stakes of actually being in that situation. Carlos Navarrete found that people are less likely to pick the utilitarian outcome of killing the one to save the five if they display high levels of emotional arousal. This observation is based on what people actually did when they were put in the virtual reality scenario. Of course, there's no way of knowing how these people would actually react in a real-world setting, but it helps us get a little closer than we would merely by asking people. It's also just quite exciting. It sounds like a lot of fun to do. Interestingly, some have suggested that using trolley problems in psychological research is limited by the qualities of it that we would now consider memeable. In 2014, Christopher Bauman argued that the fact the trolley problem is kind of funny means that people are less likely to take it seriously during psychological research. He suggests that in this context, the thought experiment lacks a certain psychological realism, meaning that people are unlikely to be going through the same messy bunch of emotional processes when they're considering that decision as they would in real life. That was 10 years ago, so I can only imagine the impact trolley problems becoming an internet meme has had on their usefulness in psychological research. I think all of this really illustrates a difference between what ethical philosophers are after from the trolley problem and what psychologists and experimental philosophers are after. As I'll argue in the next section, for the purpose of normative ethics, the trolley problem being abstract and superficially unlike the difficulties we face in everyday life can be a real strength. But if we're trying to figure out how people would actually act in a given scenario, rather than consider how we think they should act, then we might want all of these highly activated emotions that would be there in the flesh. An interesting further question for those ethical philosophers here is how should they use this data about what people would do in trolley problem scenarios? On the one hand, the is-ought gap means we cannot straightforwardly infer from what someone does or would do to what they ought to do. And just because the majority of people might do something, that doesn't make it right. But at the same time, in papers like the ones by Foote or Thompson or Cam, they are using their own ethical intuitions as the starting point for their arguments. So what makes their intuitions more qualified than the subjects of psychological surveys and experiments? For that matter, what aspect of a person's intuition should we be paying attention to when we are seeking ethical conclusions? We may not want to get rid of all of that messy emotional business, because ethical intuitions do seem infused with emotion. But at the same time, there are some variables, like the order thought experiments are presented in, which may affect how people react, but seem intuitively irrelevant to any conclusions about how we should act. It really brings some of the foundational questions about doing normative ethics to the forefront of our mind. However, there is a pretty obvious question you might have after everything I've said. And that is, what is the point? Why should we even care about trolley problems? Well, my dear viewer, I'm glad you asked. 4. The importance of getting trolleyed. The trouble with the memification of the trolley problem is that it's often dismissed as some archaic idea with no modern philosophical or practical interest. And to be fair to these critics, there is nothing in this. The trolley problem is incredibly contrived. Where in the wild do we encounter these sorts of rogue trolleys and people being tied to tracks? Even Great Western Rail doesn't have that problem. So what can this possibly tell us about how to deal with the complex, multifaceted ethical problems that we actually do have to face in the real world? Well, as far as I can tell, there are a number of strengths that thought experiments like the trolley problem have to offer that are transferable to other ethical situations, and thus make it a semi-worthwhile use of philosophical energy. The first point is that the trolley problem acts as a sort of intuition pump. There is a reason why it's used in classrooms up and down the country in introductory ethics courses. It is an easy to understand and relatively simple situation that nonetheless provokes very strong reactions in people's ethical intuitions. I've used these in discussions that I've led, and it's always fascinating to see the number of people who will adamantly defend the case of diverting the trolley while remaining vehemently opposed to toppling someone in the way of it, and yet when asked to articulate why one is acceptable but not the other, they often can't quite put their finger on it. This is a great starting point to a more detailed inquiry. I think alerting people to the potential tensions in their moral intuition can be incredibly valuable, because it helps us reconsider some of the reasons we think some things are right and some are wrong. You've chosen to watch a philosophy YouTube video, so chances are you already have an interest in this sort of thing. But many people do not. And by dramatizing ethical dilemmas that are nonetheless separate from any particular heated contemporary issue, we can get the ball rolling on some self-examination of our received ethical positions. This could be the first step to a more philosophical approach to life. Secondly, there's the matter of explaining those intuitions. What philosophers like Foote and Thompson and Cam did and do is a form of what we might term rational reconstruction. That is, they take our ethical intuitions in their messy, unsystematized state, and they try to construct a set of principles that lets them all play nicely together. The end goal of this might be to come up with a series of ideas that best track our ethical intuitions even in edge cases, and thus helps resolve tricky ethical difficulties in the real world, ones where our intuitions are much less clear. But even if we do not manage that, we can still introduce principles that help clarify what might make these difficulties so thorny. Take Cam's principle of permissible harm, for example, which broadly suggests both that we should not use people merely as a means to save others, and also not drag anyone new into a situation who is not already a participant. If we accept this principle, it has a bearing on real-world scenarios. For example, it suggests that at a public hospital, while we might be able to triage people so that the patients who require the most urgent care get beds first, we ought not to turf out an existing patient who still does require care just because another, more urgent case comes along. This is actually a rough principle followed in many hospitals around the world, including in the UK. So, if we agree with Cam, then the principle of permissible harm helps both explain and justify this decision. Articulating these sorts of ethical principles will arguably become even more important as AI starts to be placed in charge of larger and larger portions of our decision-making apparatus. It is not enough to trust our ethical gut, we must now make it programmable, and that takes having certain principles in place. The particular combination or weighted average of these principles will probably not be foolproof and may also be very complicated, but thought experiments like the trolley problem help us to form these principles. Without them, it would be much more difficult to decide the sorts of ways we may wish AI systems to act in given circumstances. For the trolley problem, this is most obvious in the case of self-driving cars. Even those who have been critical of the over-reliance on the trolley problem in the ethics of self-driving cars do tend to admit that thought experiments like this are valuable data points for a wider systemic analysis, and this would make sense. The nature of the trolley problem in particular also means it serves as a nice dialectical battleground for testing out different ethical theories. If we look at the history of the trolley problem, we can see this in action. In effect, Philippa Foot's initial formulation posed a problem. Why is it that we tend to think the driver steering from the 5 and killing the 1 is permissible, while the judge executing the one innocent man to save the 5 is impermissible? She then proposed a potential solution, the idea of negative duties to avoid harm outweighing positive duties to save. However, Thompson then came in with her own trolley problem as a counterexample. Would not the bystander or the passenger also be permitted to redirect the trolley, even though this is explicitly killing one to save the five, rather than just not getting involved? Thus, the theory is revised in terms of the situation of the victims and who has the strongest claim on them not being killed, with sheer numbers winning out if all else is equal. Then, Cam comes along with her own intricate trolley problems and her own principle of permissible harm to explain them. Of course, this does lead to a preponderance of strange and absurd-seeming trolley problems involving rockfalls, second trolleys, and third tracks. But these are all abstracted versions of complications that do arise in real-life ethical decisions. For example, say we face the choice of whether to preemptively declare war on someone in the belief that it will prevent a larger war later. Here, one relevant concern might be to do with inadvertently sparking further conflicts later down the line that will affect totally innocent people. A second trolley, if you will. Is it right for one nation to use another to fight on their behalf, believing that it will prevent a larger conflict? For some, this is like diverting the tracks, since a war is coming anyway and it's best to pick a smaller one over a larger one. But for others, this situation might seem more similar to toppling the innocent man off the bridge in order to stop the trolley in its tracks. My point is that the problem is not meant to just stand by itself, but for its frameworks to be taken out and applied to real-life ethical decisions. The trolley problem is simply isolating variables and then testing them, like in any controlled experiment. The trolley problem scenario in itself is very unlikely to happen. But its abstraction, simplicity, and manipulability mean that thinking about it ends up relevant to a great many situations. Think of the number 2. This is an abstract object that in itself is only of theoretical importance. But we can apply it to anything in the world that we can find more than one instance of. The abstract nature of the trolley problem, like the abstract nature of arithmetic, is a weakness in the sense that it loses some detail. The number 2 does not distinguish between 2 sticks and 2 fire engines, even though these are very different. But it is also a strength in that it gains applicability. Trolleys are analogized to threats more generally. The people tied to the track are anyone affected by the threat. And the principles used in this abstract scenario can then be used in either their original form or a modified one in these instantiations of the structure of the trolley problem that we find around the world. Ultimately, this is just one thought experiment among many, but it has stuck around because it manages to be both accessible, modifiable, and contain many components of a real-world ethical decision, all wrapped up in a nice abstract package. At the very least, it's probably not going anywhere for quite some time. But if you want to check out another ethical thought experiment, this time much more emotional and much more horrifying, then click here to watch me examine Ursula K. Le Guin's disturbing story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day.